We get this.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Hope lunch was good. I'm really excited about this panel. Mike, you've spent a very long...
You've written notes. You're ready to go.
I've written notes. You've got a very long career in cyber. You spent 2 decades in the Navy. You spent 5 years at the NSA. You've served...
I spent almost 4 decades in the Navy,
oh, goodness me, yeah. And you served 2 presidents. You oversaw the NSA during, a period of heightened tensions between the US and some of the other nations in the world. You're now a private citizen. You are working for Team8, founded by Nadav Zafrir, who is sat next to you. Hello. Who used to run Israel's version of the NSA. I'm delighted to have you both here. So, it's been a year since you retired from the NSA. You began working for Team8, a startup studio and a VC firm, for those who don't know, although you should. You must have had a lot of options post-government. Why did you choose Team8?
So for me, number one, I was interested, just as I was in the military, it's probably what attracted me in the first place. I was interested in a mission that I cared about. I wasn't interested in doing something that was just about money. I was interested in doing something that I thought could generate better outcomes. And so cybersecurity was an area. It wasn't just what I did in the government. It's something I believed in, and I wanted to be involved in things that I thought could improve cybersecurity in the private sector and on a global basis, not just here in the United States. I love the people, I love the model, and the chance to work with Nadav. We did not serve our respective jobs. He, the leader of Unit 8200, the NSA equivalent in Israel, me, the director of NSA, the Unit 8200 equivalent, if you will, in the US. We didn't overlap, but I had known him by reputation, and because it's a small world out there in this area. And I just thought, man, I'd love to work with him.
So what was the driving force behind working for Team8? Was it the startups? Was it the relationship that you had?
It's number one, the model. It's the idea that Team8's an organization that wants to focus on hard cybersecurity challenges that if we can solve them will make a significant difference. So that was number one. Number two, I liked the fact that, because this is something I used to say in government, I would say, look, it is great to develop technology, but if we can't actually apply this in a meaningful way, we're spending a lot of money for no purpose. It's about how do we get to outcomes. And the outcome isn't just the development of the technology, it's the application of this. And I like the fact that the Team8 model was all about, hey, we create companies to actually help this technology, this approach that we create, we then actually build a structure to actually implement it and execute it. I like that idea.
So you did get a little bit of flack from some of your former NSA colleagues for joining ostensibly a foreign firm. What do you say to that criticism?
Number one, I would argue fully compliant with the law. In fact, so anything you do with a foreign, I actually had to get permission ahead of time. So I went to the government, said, hey, look, this is an option for me. Want to make sure there's no issues, so I always get it reviewed. Secondly, my comment would be, so let me understand this. You have a problem with me working with one of our closest allies in the world. That's not the world I live in. My attitude is, if we can't think more globally, if we can't work with partners, we cannot solve problems. If you think the answer is, well, America is in cybersecurity, well, the United States is just going to do it all by itself, that has not been my experience. I find that to be a very narrow viewpoint.
And for those who don't know, obviously the relationship between the US and Israel in terms of intelligence sharing and collaboration is very close. So how did you two meet? If you didn't have any overlap in the intelligence agencies, how did you two meet?
Well, the Admiral is a good-looking gentleman, and we again, just like Mike said, we knew each other by reputation. So my successor has worked very closely with Mike and had just the most wonderful things to say about him. And so when I heard that Mike was retiring, I thought, in terms of really thinking big thoughts, in terms of really understanding the fundamental fragility of the world that we live in, this is a team sport. And what Team8 does is brings together perspectives, right? So perspectives could be the retail perspective from Walmart, aviation from Airbus, insurance from Unicre, etc. But that's not enough. You need industry perspective, you need public perspective, you need the attacker's perspective, you need the government's perspectives. Because if you want to solve big problems, you first of all have to understand these problems. And there's really no one better than Mike to be sort of the lighthouse to understand not just why we're fragile today, but why are we going to be a little bit more fragile 2 years from now.
So tell me a little bit more about this and what Mike brings to the table and to the company.
Let's not talk about Mike. There's more interesting things out there to me.
No, I know, but I'm interested. You know, what does Mike bring to the table with his experience and so on?
You know, it's first of all, it's the experience, it's the leadership, it's the. I'll give you an example. We were in Tel Aviv a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
Talking to CISOs from about 100 of the leading enterprise around the world, about 50% from the US, but the rest coming from Latin America, Europe, Asia. And what Mike talked to them about is, you know, what does it look like when you're in a real crisis? You know, what does it take if you're a CISO to understand the problem, to overcome it, to explain it to your seniors? What is the decision-making process that comes with that? That's the kind of experience that in the past, leaders in enterprise did not have or didn't have to get exposed to. But you think about what's happening today, some of the most important infrastructures that make us as a civilization are not in the hands of government like they were in the 20th century. They're in the hands of private industry, all the way from the data, the utilities, and you know, data doesn't understand geography. So thinking about where a company is founded is not the question that you should ask yourself. The question that you should ask yourself is, do they understand the challenge? Do they have the right scruples? Do they share a common ethical infrastructure? And if the answer is yes, please work with them.
So you have 7 companies in Team8 right now, is that right?
Right.
And so tell me a little bit more about these you know, the companies that you have, the challenges they're trying to solve.
Sure. So, you know, I'll tell you about a couple, right? So let's start with the physical world that surrounds us, right? You know, let's all face it. If the lights go out right now and we find out in a couple of hours or in a couple of weeks that that's happened because of some kind of cyber distortion to the local utility, nobody in this room is going to be extremely surprised, right? Because what's happening is that we're getting convergence between the physical world and the virtual world, and we're getting convergence between 2 different environments that honestly were never meant to be converged. In this case, the internet and legacy environments in the real physical worlds and utilities. And so, for example, that's one thing that we're very concerned about. And one of the companies that we started, which is Clarity, has the ability to visualize into a very, very detailed manner every black box in every physical infrastructure so that now you can connect it to the rest of the world, to the IoT, to the internet, but you can do it safely, securely, optimize everything. This is one thing that we're very, very working very closely. In fact, Galina, one of our founders, is in the crowd here, and they started a tremendous company that is now literally deployed around you know, every continent in the world, every industry in the world, making it safer, more secure, but also able to modernize it, to connect it to the rest of the world.
So one of the things you have here, IoT, industrial control systems, companies focused on privacy. Admiral, you know, privacy is a big thing these days. End-to-end encryption is on the rise. It's almost ubiquitous. It's on most messaging apps. With your experience at the NSA, how difficult is the NSA's job with the rise of end-to-end encryption?
I mean, it certainly makes, from a technical perspective, it certainly makes access potentially more challenging. You know, for us as a foreign intelligence organization operating when we're doing our mission outside the United States, there's things that we can do where you can think beyond the encryption. You can think a little bit more broadly when you're thinking about penetration and how you access. So that, you know, gives us some options. I thought the bigger challenge was more, it wasn't for us and our mission so much, but for our law enforcement teammates when I was in the government. You know, if you're the local sheriff, if you're a state trooper, if you're the FBI, and you don't have the technical means to access devices or information that may contain insights, criminal activity, exploitation of youth, drugs, kidnapping, application of violence, how do we as a society, and this is something that all of us should be concerned about. This shouldn't be the government unilaterally deciding it. You don't want an intel person or a law enforcement person deciding this. I would also argue, no disrespect to the audience, but I don't want the tech community deciding this unilaterally. My view is we need to have a conversation as a society about what are we comfortable with respect to privacy and securing the rights of the individual and the data associated with them, as well as the broader, also an imperative, how do we ensure the security and safety of our citizens?
Yeah. Right now, there seems to be a deadlock between the tech companies in Silicon Valley and law enforcement and the intelligence agencies and the US government, especially when it comes to encryption and privacy. There is this deadlock. Is there any way to break that deadlock? Would it require legislation?
Well, my attitude always was be leery of directing something from the government. Not that government doesn't have an important role, but I think just historically, in general, we don't always get that right. When I was in government, the argument I tried to make was, can't we do some very simple coordination between the private sector and the government and take a look at what's in the range of the options? Because I thought there were two questions. Number one is, what can we do? What's in the realm of the possible? And the more important conversation, though, was, well, what should we do? Because those aren't always synonymous. And one is a very technical kind of focused discussion, and the other is much more about ethics, morality, legal framework. What are we comfortable with? What's going to reflect our culture, our heritage, our structure as a nation, and the things we value? Those have all got to be part of this. It just can't be, well, in the name of security, we should be able to access anything, anywhere, at any time unilaterally. I don't buy that. I mean, I was an intel professional for 37 years. I didn't buy that.
Yeah. So Team8 is obviously doing very well right now. You've got, for the security startups in the audience, where should they be focusing their energies? What are the biggest opportunities?
Yeah, so I think we're moving from protecting the existing infrastructure to trying to think about what's the world going to look like in a few years. And so if you think about privacy, for example, right? I think there are three layers that we should think about if we are going to make good things happen. Because when we speak about cyber, we're usually focused on the really terrible things that may happen. We don't put enough emphasis on the really good things that may not happen. Because regulation is not moving fast enough, because culturally we're not moving fast enough, because we find ourselves in really bad dilemmas and conundrums between using the data and infringing privacy. So, one of the things that we're working on right now on the technology level is introducing new concept in mathematics that will enable us to do both, right? That is, to encrypt data, but still use computation on encrypted data. So there's a very smart lady her name is Shafi Goldwasser. She got the Turing Prize for this, for the theory around multi-party computation that literally allows you to take data, encrypt it, and run computation on encrypted data. So apropos government and private, for the first time in the UK, we've introduced this as a practical software which allows law enforcement to shorten the times it takes to do investigations for serious crime, anti-money laundering, etc. Encrypting their queries so there's no privacy issues, querying the data lakes of banks and other financial services without actually seeing their data, dramatically shortening the time that it takes to actually find these people without any privacy issues. And so it's always the layers, right? There's a cultural layer, as Mike said. What do we think about this as a society? Then there is the regulator level, and I think the regulator has to move from being prescriptive to being descriptive, because by the time you prescribe something as a regulator, it's always based on best practices. The problem with cyber and is that it's moving so fast that by the time something becomes a best practice, it's obsolete. So you have to be descriptive, not prescriptive. And then the layer of the technology is where we want to come in and bring fundamental changes. So Duality, which is doing homomorphic encryption, led by Professor Shafi Goldwasser and other professors, is one example. But there are others. We're also doing using multi-party computation to access blockchain without using a key at all. The company is called Curve. The idea is, here's how we protect the stuff that's already out there. Here's how we enable the future with using fundamentally transcending technologies that allow us not to be in this dilemma all the time.
Can I make one comment?
Sure, by all means.
One thing I would say to any startup, please think about security as a core aspect of whatever it is that you are developing or producing.
So whether or not you're a security startup.
Right.
Right.
Because one of the things that always amazed, look, we both ran organizations that in defending their respective nations penetrated networks for a living. And you can always tell systems in which security is a bolt-on that was added after it was written, and there are always potential access points. One thing I try to say to organizations is, look, you can't view cybersecurity as an afterthought. You need, just as you are always asking yourself, so what's the user interface? What's the user experience going to be like? I would argue you also be saying to yourself, so even as I'm optimizing that user experience, even as I'm focused on achieving the most effective, efficient way of executing whatever it is I'm trying to generate, can't you also say to yourself, and how do I do that within the most reasonable and responsible security framework that I can develop? But that part of the equation is often missing early in the cycle when it comes to development of organizations and capabilities.
You mentioned that, obviously the NSA does a lot of, offensive security work, essentially, hacking into, the enemy. And now you're working on, with startups focused on privacy, security, and defensive measures. How do you reconcile the two? You kind of go from one, career to almost, it seems like the polar opposite.
Well, remember, when I was the director of NSA and the commander of Cyber Command, I not only worked the offensive side, but I worked the defensive side. So as the commander of Cyber Command, for example, responsible for the defense of all DoD networks, data, weapon systems, and platforms from a cyber perspective. Also tasked with applying DoD, Department of Defense capability to support critical infrastructure in the private sector against cyber activity from non-US entities. So there was always, I've done every bit as much defensive stuff, if not more. NSA, we develop all the encryption from the mathematical algorithms to the actual production and distribution to include the football for the president, et cetera, every missile silo, every B-52 with nuclear weapons. So I've been part of teams that worked the encryption piece. So I was very fortunate. In my previous life, I've been able to look at this from a kind of tactical day-to-day execution. How do you defend? How do you penetrate? I've been able to be part of broader policy discussions about, okay, so how do we translate this to policy outcomes? I was very fortunate and got to spend a lot of time in the private sector between, up in New York as well as here in the Valley. So how can we partner together better? So I always try to remind people, look, I got at the offensive piece is the sexy stuff. Secondly, one of the things for me that was a red line was I will not participate in any private sector offensive activity. That, to me, should be retained under the control of the nation state.
Obviously, there's this notion of hacking back as well, which is a controversial issue recently. So
now, the challenge with hacking, not challenge, part of hacking back is, so first, it's how you define it. I have seen some people describe this from what I would consider pretty escalatory offensive acts to fairly benign, hey, look, I'm just trying to make sure I can forestall what they're doing. And there's a wide spectrum there. In general, and I can remember saying this in the White House Situation Room with the leadership many times, as an individual who was part of teams that were tasked with securing and defending, the analogy I used to use with them was, look, I know sometimes you look at me as hey, you're leading the teams that are helping. I wasn't the only one, and the DoD wasn't the only organization, but hey, you're part of this broader government effort to secure cyber. What about hackbacks? And my comment would be, look, I already feel on most days like it's the Wild West, and myself and the team I'm a part of, we're the sheriff on the street. I said the last thing, in my opinion, that you want is more people running on the street with guns. This isn't the answer. I was also concerned about, so how comfortable are we with precision and attribution? Because if you don't get the attribution right, you get massive second and third order effects. From a liability perspective, I'm not a lawyer, but one of the conversations I've had with general counsels of large companies to small companies is, so if you go down the hackback road and you incur second and third order effects, what's the legal liability for you? And most lawyers will look at you and go, well, it potentially is pretty significant. Just in general, to me, my attitude is I certainly would not go offensive.
So while I have you two on stage, I mean, you both have seen all kinds of hacks and activity over the years. What do you two do to keep safe and secure?
Nadav, hey, you go first and I'll give you an opinion.
You know, I think there's a generational gap. So my generation, you know, we grew up where everything was private and you decide what you want to publicize, right? What do you want to publish? And we're almost in a situation today where it's the opposite. You know, everything's public, but you can still choose what you want to keep private. And I think this generation, you know, millennials and beyond, I think there's going to be a backlash back to privacy. And I think the world in which we traded our data and privacy for convenience, that party is about to end. I think the music is subsiding. I don't think that's going to be the future. I think in the future we'll see a backlash back to privacy. I think people value their privacy. I think it's a fundamental right that we have. And in that sense, I think the key word is trust. So, you know, we came from a world where we knew each other, we grew up together, we had coffee, we talked, so we got trust. And then the world got connected. And so we said, we trust, but we need to trust but verify. And then the world became hyper-connected. And we said, now we are going for zero trust. And zero trust sounds very appealing, but it's also very costly. And so I think where we should go is beyond trust. Beyond trust meaning the stakes have to be at a position where we're able to collaborate without the high price of zero trust. And that's this kind of stuff that we're trying to do with homomorphic encryption, with duality, with MPC, with Curve, going forward, creating that infrastructure that takes us beyond trust.
Admiral, we only have a minute left on the clock. You know, you spent 5 years at the NSA during a pretty, you know, many changes happened.
Interesting time.
Interesting times, let's say. You oversaw the NSA during the aftermath of the Snowden disclosures. There were multiple leaks. There was the exposure of the NSA's prized hacking tools by the shadow brokers. What is your biggest regret?
I'll be honest, I have very few, if any. I feel more pride than anything else. I got to work with incredibly motivated men and women doing something that mattered within a legal framework that we fully supported. And in so doing, we created increased security for the citizens and our friends and allies.
And do you think NSA
I loved every day of that, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat.
And do you think NSA is ready to continue with its mission for the next 5 years, 10 years, given the issues that we're facing with encryption and privacy and so on today?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been challenge. Hell, I can remember in the late 90s when we were going from radio frequency-based communications to the world of the network. And I can remember at the time was the executive assistant to the senior kind of signals intelligence officer in the Navy. And he was having a discussion with the director of NSA, and the director was telling him, oh man, things are terrible. You know, we're going to lose access. We're not going to be able to do some of the things we used to do. And my attitude is, look, you look at these motivated men and women, you look at their focus, you look at their commitment, you look at the level of support that this nation, its citizens, the money, the legal framework that we've created to try to make sure we strike a balance and that we're mindful that we are operating as intelligence professionals in a democracy. This isn't the authoritarian states of my counterparts in Beijing or Moscow, where I would look at what they would do and I'd go, we not only couldn't do that, I would never do that. That would never work within this legal framework and the fundamental idea of the rights of the individual. We couldn't operate, I wouldn't operate like that. Bottom line is I always tend to be a positive individual. Look, motivated men and women can take hard problems and they'll do well. And there are such motivated men and women on those teams at NSA, at Cyber Command. I was very fortunate to be a part of it. I was very fortunate to get to work with teammates like 8200 in Tel Aviv and in other places around the world to try to address problems that You know, if we didn't solve them or if we didn't improve our ability, we were going to see men and women die. You don't ever forget that in the job.
That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Appreciate it.